When most people hear the name Machiavelli, they think of a scheming villain, an amoral puppet master who inspired tyrants all throughout the ages. For centuries, his very name has been synonymous with deceit, cruelty, and ruthless power politics. To call someone Machiavellian is to brand them as calculating, manipulative, even dangerous. His most famous portrait, with the slicked hair and subtle, condescending smirk, is often described as a portrait of evil. But what if I told you that that smile was actually that of a practical joker, a comedy writer, and a ladies' man? Believe it or not, during his lifetime, Machiavelli was actually more famous as a playwright of raunchy comedies than he was as a diplomat. Far from teaching rulers to be monsters, many of his writings, often ignored, praise liberty, civic virtue, and republican government. If you're just a little bit curious about the real man behind the mysterious smile, then join us as we dive into the life and times of one of the most controversial thinkers in history, and discover that the Machiavelli you think you know may never have existed at all. If you enjoy our content, please show us some love by liking and sharing with your friends, dropping a comment or two, and by subscribing to the channel. It really does help us grow and reach more people. Check out our socials and website too for additional material, interesting historical nuggets, and news.
A city is made great by the freedom of its citizens.
Our story begins in Renaissance Florence. The Roman Empire of old was long dead, collapsed under the waves of barbarian hordes. By the turn of the first millennium AD, urban centres, linked by excellent Roman roads, became increasingly autonomous. Some of these cities, like Venice and Genoa, became maritime trading centres, while others, such as Milan and Naples, became powerful military states, expanding through the conquest of their weaker neighbours. Florence, originally a modest-sized textile and transport hub on the banks of the Arno River, developed into a finance and banking centre, whose stable and reliable currency, the gold florin, was soon adopted all across Europe. But independence came at a price. The Italian peninsula soon became a major battleground of Europe. A patchwork of poorly defended city-states caught in the endless contest between the Pope and the regional big boys, France, Aragon, and the Holy Roman Empire. As the numerous wars between these parties dragged on over the course of centuries, the smaller, more vulnerable states were dragged in, and territories switched sides, often multiple times, making conquest of the entire peninsula all but impossible. In this environment, every city was torn apart by rival factions, loyal to one or other of the major powers. By the 14th century, Florentine bankers were Europe's treasurers, lending fortunes to both kings and popes. But lest you think that war is always good business for bankers, when Edward III of England defaulted on enormous loans during the 100 Years' War, Florence's banks collapsed in a chain of bankruptcies. The shockwave of insolvency rippled across Europe and reminded Florentines that their fortunes were tied not just to their own industry, but to the behaviour of foreign rulers as well. It would not be the last time Florence faced a bank run, but we're getting just a little ahead of ourselves. As if the wars and subsequent banking collapse of 1345 weren't bad enough, the apocalyptic arrival of the Black Death, just 3 years later, changed the face of Europe forever. In a matter of months, perhaps half the population of Florence was gone. Streets lay silent. Entire families vanished. And chroniclers painted scenes of desolation. It was as if the end of the world was nigh. Yet, out of the devastation came fresh opportunity. As labour became scarce, workers grew bolder. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands, and new fortunes were made. In Florence, the trauma etched itself into memory, yet the city endured and even reinvented itself. An exiled son, Giovanni Boccaccio, wrote his epic collection of Florentine survival stories in the aftermath, the Decameron, capturing both the despair and the resilience of a city determined to live. He was actually preceded by moral poet and fellow countryman Dante Alighieri, who placed ordinary Florentines within his epic vision of eternity, suggesting that even common lives could echo in the divine order. Additionally, Florence was blessed to be the home of Francesco Petrarca, smouldering love poet, philosopher, and all-round titan of classical scholarship, who seduced every literate European into his passion for the ancient world, proposing that the study of humanity was as vital as the study of God himself. Together, these three Florentine geniuses heralded a radical new psychology to challenge the fatalism that had ossified European thinking for centuries, namely, that men and women could not just be spectators, but actors in history. With these so-called Tre Corone Fiorentine, or three crowns of literature, Florence became a magnet destination for restless poets, intellectual seekers, and classical scholars. By the early 15th century, having become the capital of classical scholarship, Florence was uniquely primed to be the incubator of Renaissance humanism, and soon, one family, the Medici, would harness this spirit, shaping Florence's destiny for a century to come.
Princes and republics that wish to maintain themselves free from corruption must, above all, preserve the public's sense of liberty.
The Medici were not born princes. They became so by mastering the world of money, rising from humble origins in the textile trade to create a new banking empire that stretched across Europe, even becoming the exclusive bankers of the papacy. They funded allies, manipulated elections, and exiled rivals, controlling affairs of state from behind the scenes. Through Medici patronage, Florence became much more than a rich mercantile republic. It became the intellectual capital of Europe. Painters, sculptors, philosophers, and poets all gravitated to the city from as far away as Scotland, knowing that here their genius could find both a stage and an audience. Florence was the proverbial light on the hill that transformed European culture in a seismic wave of change, while the powerful influence of the Medici Bank ensured peace and relative cooperation among the many otherwise squabbling statelets of Italy. Now, it's probably worth mentioning at this point that even as Florence was dazzling the world, and its citizens enjoyed a rare period of peace and stability, the city's government, or signoria, was nevertheless consumed by an ongoing obsession that would continually bleed its coffers and, on more than one occasion, risked bringing down the entire republic. That obsession was the city of Pisa. The ancient maritime Republic of Pisa, sitting at the mouth of the Arno, controlled Florence's gateway to the sea. To a landlocked city, dependent on rival ports like Genoa and Venice, acquiring Pisa represented both economic expediency and civic pride. In 1406, Florence finally managed to seize Pisa after a long and expensive war, but conquest proved harder than victory, The embattled Pisans resisted bitterly, and for decades Florence poured both blood and treasure into garrisons, bribes, mercenaries, and fortifications to subdue them. The ongoing struggle to secure Pisa would come to play a huge role in both the destiny of Florence and that of another genius who grew up just down the road from where a young artist by the name of Leonardo da Vinci was studying.
When evening comes, I return home and enter my study. On the threshold, I take off my muddy clothes, and in regal and courtly garments, I enter the ancient courts of men of old.
Niccolò di Bernardo de Machiavelli was born in Florence on the 3rd of May, 1469, into a family of modest standing. His surname carried the echo of old nobility, but by the time of his birth, the family's fortunes had long since waned. The Machiavelli were respected, but not powerful, and definitely not rich. His father Bernardo was a lawyer, though not a particularly notable one. He had inherited debts he could never quite shake off, a situation that prohibited him and any of his children from not only practicing law, but also from holding any kind of public office. Yet Bernardo possessed something far more enduring than wealth: a love of literature. He built up a small library of rare classical and humanist texts coming in from Constantinople, carefully cataloguing them. Though money was scarce, books were abundant in the Machiavelli household. Niccolò and his siblings thus grew up in a home where the writings of Cicero, Ovid, and Livy were read as bedtime stories, and by all accounts, this love of literature fostered a lifelong bond of affection between father and son. His mother, Bartolomea, offered a different example. Pious and devout, she instilled in her children a grounding in faith and in the rituals of the church. Between his father's classical leanings and his mother's religiosity, the young Machiavelli absorbed two competing currents of Florentine culture: a reverence for history and a submissive religiosity, growing up at a time of rare peace and prosperity. The third of 4 children, the family's precarious finances meant that each had to make their own way with limited prospects. Niccolò's lesser options meant that he had to settle for a liberal arts degree at the Studio Fiorentino, which afforded fewer opportunities for top jobs or public acclaim. Despite this handicap, his father had taught him Latin and Greek, and with Bernardo's many literary contacts, he secured an internship for his son under the wing of some powerful figures in the Medici court, observing the machinery of government firsthand and developing his knowledge of law and politics far more practically than he would have under any professor. Things were coming along swimmingly for our young intern, but then in 1492, just a few months before Christopher Columbus was to come ashore in the New World, Lorenzo the Magnificent, head of the Medici family, died. In a government that had become complacent and apathetic after decades of glamour and prosperity, Lorenzo's son Piero, lacking any of the guile and foresight of his father, assumed the reins of power with little opposition. The delicate patchwork of alliances fostered by Lorenzo rapidly began to disintegrate as old rivalries resurfaced, without the tempering effect of a patriarchal cash broker. The unravelling began with the usurpation of power in Milan by Ludovico Sforza, uncle and regent of the rightful duke, Gian Galeazzo Sforza. Ludovico sidelined his naive nephew and married him off to Isabella of Aragon, the granddaughter of King Ferdinand I of Naples. As he came of age, the Neapolitans agitated to have the young duke assume the reins of power from his uncle, which would, of course, enable them in turn to exert considerable influence over the Milanese court, and with it much of northern Italy. But Uncle Ludovico was having none of it, and had consistently thwarted Aragonese meddling in state affairs for years. By the time of Lorenzo de' Medici's death, Ludovico Sforza was de facto ruler of Milan, had himself married King Ferdinand's other granddaughter, and had now also sired a son of his own, fully intent on hanging on to power. The trouble was, his nephew, the rightful heir, had also fathered a son, and with a succession crisis now looming, both wives, who were cousins, escalated tensions, each appealing to the King of Naples to step in on their side. Ferdinand considered himself lucky to have died before having to adjudicate, but when his son Alfonso ascended the throne, he understandably threw his weight behind his own daughter, the wife of the rightful duke, and now mobilized an army to back them. Uncle Lorenzo understandably panicked. He had worked tirelessly to marginalize his hapless nephew. Receiving little sympathy from his neighbours, he now made the fateful decision to call in the big guns from outside to support his position, making the French king, Charles VIII, a deal he could hardly refuse. You see, King Charles had built up the finest army in Europe, with cutting-edge new artillery that caused dread among all the monarchs on the continent. He was a descendant of the kings of Anjou, who just happened to have a historically legitimate claim to the Kingdom of Naples, despite it now being ruled by the Spanish House of Aragon. Anyway, none of Charles' predecessors were in a position to press the claim, but our young French king, eager for fame and glory, was egged on by Ludovico to stake his claim and invade, being promised support by the Milanese regent. Ludovico was hoping that Naples would be so distracted by the French invasion that they would come to terms with him, while he fully expected all the other Italian states to check the advance of the French, such that the exercise, while beneficial for him, would be fruitless for everyone else. But it was a gamble that proved catastrophic. Charles, young and impetuous, embraced the idea with reckless enthusiasm. In 1494, he personally led a French army across the Alps, 25,000 strong, including Swiss mercenaries and artillery that could crumble Italian fortresses in days. Ludovico thought he was playing a clever diplomatic game, but in reality, he had just invited the storm that would sweep Italy into chaos. As poorly fortified northern cities fell like dominoes, Florence, completely blindsided by the French invasion, also now descended into panic, and the Signoria now turned to Piero de' Medici to lead them out. But the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent turned out to be a bumbling idiot, who had the sage idea of simply riding out to the French camp and completely acquiescing to all of Charles' demands, pledging his full support for the campaign, and begging him not to sack Florence. The French could hardly believe their ears, expecting at least some token resistance, but when the smiling Piero returned home, fully expecting to be greeted as a saving hero, he was instead met with fury by a populace long and fiercely proud of their independence. As Florence descended into chaos, Piero and the rest of the Medici family fled the city into exile, tout suite. In the remaining vacuum, a new saviour figure was to emerge from the shadows.
Armed prophets succeed, unarmed ones are destroyed.
Girolamo Savonarola was a Dominican friar from Ferrara, austere by nature and gifted in speech. He first arrived in Florence in the 1480s at the invitation of Lorenzo the Magnificent, preaching with little notice until his fiery sermons against corruption and immorality began to draw some support. As the French army drew nearer, he declared to the panicked citizenry that this catastrophic foreign invasion was the result of the city's flirtation with pagan art, literature, and ideas. He prophesied that Florence's collapse was imminent and that the time had come to eliminate the books, art, and people who were promoting the devil's work, and if they did so with fervency and zeal, the Lord would surely reward them with peace and prosperity. In his own words, Florence would become the New Jerusalem. The fire and brimstone sermons found an audience, and in their panic, the Signoria saw fit to appoint Savonarola to a negotiation committee. He also now rode out to meet the French king. Charles, flattered by Savonarola's declaration that the French were the vehicle of God's purification of Italy, made him a few concessions, and in any case, they were happy to have avoided wasting time in laying yet another siege. But they did insist on the renewed independence of Pisa, for which France would act as guarantor. Well, the Pisans lost no time in expelling the Florentine garrison, while the French themselves moved on quickly to conquer Naples, which also capitulated without so much as a whimper. Anyway, despite the loss of Pisa, Savonarola was the star of the moment, and the Signoria, seeing him as a non-partisan player and having broad support among both the peasants and the otherwise polarized elites, quickly appointed him as their new head of state, with special powers to curb civic unrest. Meanwhile, the unchecked marauding of the French army panicked Italy's other states, notably Venice and the papacy, who soon banded together along with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire to form the League of Venice, which now pressured Charles to abandon Naples almost as soon as he had conquered it. The rapid French advance turned into a fighting retreat all the way back across the border. The French nevertheless continued to exert considerable influence despite their reversal, such that Pisa remained unmolested and Florence remained nominally a French vassal. Now, at first, Florence's new monkish dictator introduced numerous beneficial reforms into the government to try and curb the factionalism that had long crippled effective governance. But he also escalated his public preaching, and as his power grew, the sermons became increasingly extreme and apocalyptic, calling for the toppling of statues and the public burning of books and art as an act of penance to restore divine favour. Mobs of teenagers, enraptured by his charisma, forced their way into homes and public buildings, stripping them of any books, paintings or sculpture that could be interpreted as obscene or pagan. They also confiscated such mundane personal items as wigs, makeup, and even perfume, lobbing everything onto a massive fire that has come to be known as the Bonfire of the Vanities. Considering that Florence was, at the time, the perfume capital of Europe, it was quite an economically destructive thing to do. These same puritanical mobs now roamed the streets, beating up anyone accused of immoral behaviour, and Savonarola saw to it that any opponents were quickly vilified as evil and forced into exile. Both the economy and body odour was getting so bad that many of his own supporters in the Signoria began plotting against him, no doubt driven by their irate wives. Hell hath no fury like a lady denied her eau de toilette. Within just 3 years, the city had devolved into a backwards medieval theocracy, with scarcely a book left on any shelf. Citizens were forced into compulsory religious processions, businesses shut, trade dried up, and the economy tanked. And as the reign of terror continued, the collective patience of the citizenry for God to deliver on their leaders' promises now also began to evaporate. But Savonarola was on a roll, and not contenting himself with criticising the worldly pursuits of his own countrymen, he turned his sights and sermons fully towards Rome itself. With blistering criticisms of papal excess, he now directed many of his tirades of blame at the delay in recovery toward the Pope himself, accusing the Church of debauchery and a multitude of other mortal sins that was, to be fair, completely justified. But demonizing the Supreme Pontiff turned out to be a bridge too far, and Pope Alexander VI finally lost patience with him, excommunicating the pious tyrant and threatening the entire city with excommunication as well. Savonarola toned it down a little, but he had now already managed to turn everyone against him. An attempt to prove his divine credentials by walking on hot coals in a public trial by fire was cancelled after the coals were extinguished in a freak rainstorm. To many, this was beginning to look like the work of the devil, and his reputation took a hammering. By April of 1498, his fate was finally sealed, when Charles VIII of France, who had been his benefactor, died, and the holy roller was now skating on thin ice. How's that for a mixed metaphor? Anyway, within a month, he and his closest lieutenants had earned themselves a bonfire of their own, if you get my drift, in the main square of the city, and Florence threw off the French yoke, declaring the Republic to be once again independent. Observing this entire descent into anarchy was Machiavelli, a young parliamentary office clerk in his 20s, who, despite being no fan of the theocracy or the French, nevertheless assessed the situation from a cold, clinical perspective.
The people are by nature fickle. It is easy to persuade them of something, but difficult to keep them in that persuasion. Therefore, it is necessary to arrange matters so that when they no longer believe, they can be made to believe by force.
Machiavelli believed that Savonarola's first mistake was that he lacked a professional militia to enforce his rule, relying instead on a fickle mob that could easily turn against him. And secondly, that he failed to completely destroy his enemies, either in the Signoria or later at the Vatican. Dealing with local politicians was one thing, but taking on the Pope himself, with zero realistic means of destroying him outside of divine intervention, was the ultimate folly.
A wise man ought never to put himself in the path of someone more powerful unless he has good reason and sufficient forces to support him.
But there's another side to Machiavelli's writings on this time. Historian Erika Benner suggests that he was so disturbed by the ease at which a republic, so proud of its independence, artistic achievements, and liberty could be subverted, that it was important to highlight the mechanisms that despots used to achieve it.
Men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that he who deceives will always find someone who will let himself be deceived.
Machiavelli uses Savonarola as his prime example of a prophet unarmed. He had vision, but no power. For Machiavelli, the lesson was brutal. Ideas must be backed by force.
A prince who relies entirely on fortune will fall as soon as fortune changes.
With the savaging of reputations, and now a desperation to repair the damage to Florence's economy, a general council was called of the city's elders to appoint fresh talent to the civil service. Niccolò's emergence into the public eye occurred precisely at this tumultuous time, in the aftermath of both Medici exile and Savonarola's catastrophic four-year theocracy. From complete obscurity, we now find him appointed Secretary of the Second Chancellery, or what we might today call the Department of Foreign Affairs and Defence. The First Chancellery, or Department of Home Affairs, was concerned with domestic issues and the economy, and as now was the more senior of the two entities. Both of these departments, or ministries, reported to the Signoria, or what we might call an executive cabinet, who were responsible for formulating policy, and this Signoria in turn was headed by the Gonfaloniere, or president, who served a 2-month rotating term. As Secretary of the Foreign Affairs Department, Machiavelli was responsible for filtering and assessing incoming correspondence, briefing ministers, and in drafting diplomatic dispatches. He was aided by a large staff of clerks and assistants, most of whom were not only older than he, but also much more qualified, being law graduates and, for the most part, members of the nobility. Several historians have questioned how it was possible that a relative nobody could suddenly be thrust into such a responsible position, and the only conclusion seems to be that chance, or the Latin word fortuna, something Machiavelli would later write much about, must have created a rare situation where competence and reliability were considered more important than wealth or pedigree. It also probably helped that another mentor, Marcello Virgilio Adriani, had just been elected Secretary of the First Chancellery and perhaps needed a counterpart he could both trust and rely on. Niccolò seems to have taken to the appointment with considerable energy, while his lucid and concise ministerial briefs regularly won him praise from both the Signoria and foreign correspondents. His competence, likability, and skills saw him quickly additionally appointed as Secretary to the Ministry of War, a completely separate, full-time job he did in addition to his role as Foreign Secretary. You see, Pisa's continued independence was an open sore for the Signoria, and the new government lost no time declaring war on them, via the usual mechanism of raising taxes, hiring mercenaries who were themselves led by yet more mercenary generals. Consequently, Machiavelli's desk was soon piled high with endless requests for more money, more troops, complaints, and threats of mutiny in battlefield reports that put the soldiery in a dismal light. In this role, he came to believe that Italy's vulnerability, both to foreign invasion and the success of local campaigns, lay in the traditional use of hired foreign mercenaries, rather than in maintaining a permanent citizen army, who would be both loyal and invested in the outcome.
Italy has been overrun by Charles, plundered by Louis, ravaged by Ferdinand, and insulted by the Swiss. And this has happened because of nothing else than the arms she has used for so many years. A prince who relies on mercenaries will never stand firm or secure, for they are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, unfaithful, bold among friends, cowardly among enemies.
His first field assignment was to mollify a condottiere, or a mercenary general, who had been continually pleading for more money and troops, and was now threatening disengagement from the war. The assignment was to tell him in no uncertain terms that neither money nor troops were forthcoming, but to nevertheless attempt to reassure him of their gratitude and ongoing respect. Machiavelli somehow managed to smooth over the general and returned home to great applause. Salvaging an impossible situation would become the template that defined his entire diplomatic career. That he consistently succeeded marks him as one of the most extraordinarily talented diplomats in history. Speaking of war, in late 1500, the Signoria now dispatched him to directly assess the situation in Pisa, which had deteriorated into a fruitless siege, in hopes he could recommend an appropriate course of action. Again, barely 30 years old, and with no military training whatsoever, Machiavelli was expected to assess a full-scale campaign, and yet, when he returned, urging an all-out assault, the Signoria backed him. The condottiere who was hired to lead the army launched his assault, and his men even managed to breach the walls. But with victory within his grasp, he inexplicably pulled them back, and the assault failed. The offending commander was recalled, charged with treason, and executed. To Machiavelli, this debacle served as yet another example of the fickle nature of hired mercenaries that he would consistently rail against throughout his writings. To make matters worse, against his advice, the frustrated Signoria, not having learned a thing, simply scaled up their folly by contracting yet another 5,000 Swiss mercenaries and promising to pay for 10,000 more French ones. Suffice it to say, the cash-strapped Signoria had overpromised and underdelivered, and with a further delay in wages, the foreign troops also mutinied, leaving the Pisan siege in an even greater shambles, and the Florentine treasury dangerously empty. So it was that he was now desperately sent to France to try and renegotiate some of the debt owed to the new French king, Louis XII. But the king squarely viewed the Signoria as having caused the mutiny in the first place, by delaying wages and undersupplying his army. So Machiavelli was kept at arm's length for months, desperately trying to win over key courtiers behind the scenes. The Signoria made Machiavelli's task even harder by a meagre diplomatic budget that saw him continually draw on his own funds just to keep up appearances. But as the months went by, the polite indifference of the French suddenly changed for the better, as their interests in the north of Italy became threatened by the expansionist conquests of their protégé, the Duke of Valentino, one Cesare Borgia, a rapacious young warlord who had already swallowed up several neighbours in a Renaissance-era blitzkrieg right next door to Tuscany. Machiavelli, arguing that Florence could serve as a useful buffer, finally secured a letter, signed by the king himself, warning Borgia to back off. Machiavelli had failed to reduce Florence's debt, to obtain a formal alliance or even a treaty, but, for the time being, Florence was safe from invasion, and Borgia turned his attention elsewhere. For Machiavelli, the mission held three sobering lessons. First, it was a reminder of the limits of negotiation. A small, piddling state like Florence could flatter, cajole, and appeal, but ultimately, France held all the cards. Secondly, it also showed how diplomacy could succeed, not by strength, but by aligning yourself with a stronger patron and using their interests to your advantage. And thirdly, that fortune and circumstance made Florence valuable at exactly the right moment. But fortune would also play a cruel fate in his own life during this time. Both his father and one of his sisters had died during his absence. For Niccolò, it meant both the grief of losing a father and, with his brother entering the clergy, the greater pressure of becoming the head of the family. He was 31, unmarried, and financially stretched. He was exhausted and homesick. We have few words from Machiavelli himself on these private matters, but in his letters and later reflections we hear an echo of their weight. He speaks of the bitterness of fortune, of the sudden reversals that leave men at once hopeful and undone. And yet, soon after his arrival home, he was to marry Marietta Corsini, the daughter of a respected Florentine family, probably arranged to stabilize his position socially and financially. But he wouldn't enjoy home and hearth for long. The Signoria had another urgent mission for him: to meet with Borgia personally.
I shall not hesitate to cite Cesare Borgia as an example. He is a man to be imitated by all princes who come to power by fortune.
Few figures of the Italian Renaissance embodied both the splendour and the savagery of the age more completely than Cesare Borgia. Born in 1475, he was the illegitimate son of Rodrigo Borgia, who in 1492 ascended the papal throne as Pope Alexander VI. From that moment, Cesare's fate was bound to his father's power. Originally destined for the church, Cesare was made a cardinal at just 18. But he was never meant for the cassock. In 1498, he abandoned his red hat and took up the sword, an extraordinary move sanctioned by his father. With papal influence behind him, and French backing secured through marriage alliances, Cesare saw himself as invincible. He pursued a ruthless ambition to carve out a state of his own in central Italy. He marched with impunity into the Romagna region of the central north, seizing one petty lordship after another. Rimini, Pesaro, Forlì, Imola, all fell to his calculated mixture of military force, political cunning, and sudden terror. Those who resisted were destroyed. Those who bent the knee were allowed to serve, but always in the perpetual shadow of fear. Cesare's rise made him the most notorious figure of his time. Chroniclers whispered of his charisma and cruelty in equal measure. Handsome and well-spoken, he was said to move with elegance and charm in courts and banquets, yet simultaneously murdered his rivals, including his own brother and two of his brothers-in-law, in cold blood. He rewarded loyalty lavishly while it suited him, then executed his own generals as scapegoats when the public rose up in defiance. In him, contemporaries saw the very image of fortune's favourite: bold, daring, callous, and unstoppable. For Florence, his ascent was deeply unsettling. As Cesare Borgia expanded across the Romagna, the Republic's eastern frontier trembled. Florence had barely survived the French invasion and the upheavals of Savonarola. Now it faced a new and unpredictable neighbour, one with the Pope's blessing and the King of France's support. The possibility that Cesare Borgia might turn his attention to Florence was very real. Florence knew full well that French guarantees were conditional and could be revoked in a heartbeat, especially if their interests in the region suddenly changed. Moreover, a French warning letter might stop Cesare from an outright invasion, but it did nothing to prevent him meddling in Tuscan affairs indirectly, pressuring them on Pisa, stirring discontent, or supporting condottieri hostile to Florence. The Signoria wanted to know firsthand what Borgia's intentions were. It was in this climate that Machiavelli was sent to negotiate with him in 1502. The young secretary now found himself face to face with a man who seemed to embody everything he would later write about. Cesare Borgia was both a threat and a lesson, and for Machiavelli, an education unlike any he had ever received. During their meetings, Cesare listened politely, but made no firm promises. His style was to keep options open, never binding himself. Machiavelli's regular dispatches back to Florence are remarkable in their depth and insight, and are some of the most penetrating observations of leaders we have from that time. He described Borgia as decisive, adaptable, and terrifyingly effective. He praised his ability to strike swiftly at his enemies, and his skill in turning fortune to his own advantage. He noted how the Duke punished betrayal instantly, rewarded loyalty lavishly, and struck fear into enemies and allies alike. Where Florence hesitated, Cesare acted. Where Florence debated, he dominated. The most shocking lesson came at Senigallia in December of 1502. Cesare invited several of his condottieri captains, suspected of treachery, to a meeting under safe conduct. There, before Machiavelli's eyes, he had them seized and executed. Treachery was punished with treachery, but in this one brutal stroke, Cesare Borgia secured his position in the Romagna. Machiavelli reported back to Florence with a mixture of awe and unease. Here was a man who ruled not with laws or counsels, but with fear, subterfuge, and calculated cruelty. After this incident, Borgia turned his full attention to Machiavelli, intimidating and threatening him, demanding gold and the standing down of Florence's leaders, in whose place he would reinstall the Medici, his dependents, to rule as his puppets. Florence had 4 days to comply, or he would march on the city and raze it to the ground. Machiavelli rode all night to inform the Signoria, who, heeding his advice and calling Borgia's bluff, now prepared a large cash payment, but instead of paying him off, they sent it to France instead, with pleas of assistance. Sure enough, the French king, happy to cash in for the time being, marched his troops to the border, and Borgia backed off. In Machiavelli's next face-to-face meeting with him, Borgia was suddenly much more respectful, giving Machiavelli due credit for his skill as a negotiator and for calling his bluff. Machiavelli, for his part, was fascinated by the warlord, whom he thought to be the most dangerous man alive.
He never ceases from seeking glory or enlarging his state, and he fears no effort or danger. He arrives in a place before it has been noticed that he set out from another. His soldiers love him. He has recruited the best men in Italy, and all of this makes him virtuous and formidable, to which we should add that he is perpetually lucky.
In The Prince, Machiavelli praises this phase of Borgia's career as an example of virtù, or virtue, not in our nice guy definition, but in its ancient Roman context of manliness, vir being the Latin word for man. That is to say, virtù was defined as decisiveness, adaptability, and the ability to inspire both fear and loyalty. He noted how Borgia established strong foundations for his new state by eliminating rivals, securing the backing of stronger states, and executing scapegoats in a show of public justice. As someone who wanted Italy safe from foreign invasion, it's easy to see how Machiavelli felt that the peninsula needed a strong man, such as Borgia, to get the job done. But Borgia's luck was soon to run out. His father, the Pope, irritated at the French for their lacklustre support, decided to turn instead to the Spanish, hoping to play both these giants off against each other, while he carried on expanding his own state in the background. During a state dinner in 1503, the Pope had tried to assassinate a political opponent, but bungled the attempt and ended up poisoning himself and his son Cesare instead. Pope Alexander VI died a few days later, but Cesare recovered, albeit with an ongoing illness that threw him into long bouts of delirium. In the papal conclave that followed, he unwisely backed the wrong candidate, and when Pope Julius II was chosen, it sealed the fate of Cesare Borgia. The new pope had him arrested, tortured, and on the testimony of countless victims, had him condemned to prison for his many evils, eventually being murdered 4 years later after he went into exile.
I shall not hesitate to place him before all others as a model for imitation. He knew how to win men over or destroy them, and his foundations were laid so well that, had he not been opposed by an extraordinary malignity of fortune, he would have achieved greatness.
But the traditional interpretation of Machiavelli's glowing assessment of Cesare Borgia as a model leader has been challenged as too shallow. On the surface, his portrait of him looks like open admiration, but for Florentines it was also a warning in disguise. Here is how tyrants behave, and here is why republics must guard against them. It's been suggested that this layered, ironic style is exactly why The Prince has been misread for centuries. It tells princes what they want to hear, while arming free citizens with the knowledge to resist them. To Machiavelli, Borgia's power, despite his own talents, ultimately rested on luck and outside support. When fortune turned, he fell hard. His cruelty made him feared but not loved. No one came to his aid, and this was a typical historical pattern that Machiavelli would point out over and over. We'll have more to say on this later, but we're getting just a little ahead of ourselves.
Fortune shows her power where valor has not prepared to resist her.
During his time away, a number of things had occurred back home. His wife, frustrated by Niccolo's long absences, and more importantly a lack of funds to run the household, had nevertheless given birth to 2 children, a girl, Primerana, in 1502, and a son, Bernardo, named after his grandfather, born in 1503. Niccolò was absent so often that his friends and colleagues often ribbed him that it was a miracle he found the time to father children. One colleague, who visited the home in his absence, wrote to him,
My very dear compare, congratulations! Truly, your Madonna Marietta did not deceive you, for the child is your spitting image. Leonardo da Vinci could not have done a better portrait.
This was just one of many examples of the cheeky and jovial correspondence between Machiavelli and his friends over the years. Returning to his job at the Chancellery, his experience of foreign aggression led him to lobby hard for the raising of a permanent defence force. But the Signoria had just voted to give its president life tenure, and were terrified of the risk of an army being used against its own citizens. So the motion failed. Instead, having survived French invasions, a theocratic nightmare, and now a megalomaniac neighbouring warlord, they decided the time was right yet again to resume their war against Pisa, and levied money to pay yet more mercenaries, while Machiavelli sunk his head in disbelief. The siege of Pisa once again degenerated into the usual expensive stalemate, bleeding the city's coffers dry. With Florence now in complete humiliation, Machiavelli's desperate plea for a professional army was finally given the green light, and he quickly set about with recruitment and training. It was just as well, because the new pontiff turned out to be yet another pope who saw himself more of a warlord than a spiritual leader. In this case, he just happened to be a gifted one at that. Padre Julius decided it was in God's interest to unite all of the smaller central northern statelets under his own banner, and in this venture he demanded Florence supply both money and troops. Worse still, he insisted they not only withdraw from Pisa, but also restore the Medici to all their previous positions. But with resources scarce, and fear that a Medici return would unravel their government, yet again Machiavelli was hastily dispatched to Rome to stall for time, and do what he could to placate the pontiff, without actually capitulating to his demands. Despite his best efforts, the Pope was no sucker, and under threat of penalties, both divine and temporal, the Republic reluctantly diverted what meagre resources it had to aid his campaign. As cities fell to the papal army almost without resistance, Machiavelli was impressed by the sheer psychological power that a religious leader brings to politics, and though he was disgusted by the papacy's unrestrained corruption, he developed a solid respect for the religious dimension in his writings on political power. Now, it's worth noting here that back on the home front things were once again not going so well. His domestic life was far from blissful. Poor old Madonna Marietta, despite by now having borne him 3 children, consistently lacked the funds to run the household, bitterly complaining about his ongoing neglect, and relying on the intervention of his work colleagues to pay her household bills. To make matters worse, rumours were beginning to circulate about Machiavelli's own double life. It turns out that, for quite some time, our boy Niccolò was a bit of a rake, with a string of mistresses in virtually every town he had been stationed in. Worse still, even when he was home, he was seen frequenting both taverns and, how shall we say, the red light district, often recounting lewd tales of his strenuous exploits to all his mates. No wonder Mrs. M was beside herself. But news of his boozing and schmoozing was now becoming a source of embarrassment to some of his senior supporters. Over the next year, he was subject to numerous scandals and libel that tarnished his professional reputation and seriously compromised his career. Outside of Florence, peace too was soon to be shattered, when in 1507 Pope Julius's great vision of dominating Italy itself came to a jarring halt. News filtered in that the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I, was planning an invasion to take Milan from the French, and all of a sudden, everyone was sending envoys to Germany to sweet-talk the emperor. Now, in the words of a much later libertine, Voltaire, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. But this threat to Italian stability was a real one, and when Florence's government received an ultimatum to either fork out 50,000 ducats for protection or suffer the wrath of his army, the city elders scrambled to send an emissary to negotiate. The obvious candidate was Machiavelli, but the Signoria now saw him as morally compromised, and decided instead to send a young nobleman. But within 12 months, the emperor's threats escalated, and the new emissary was in a complete panic. So Machiavelli was now dispatched in all haste to bail him out and find a solution. Sure enough, he masterfully played the vacillating emperor and both reduced the sum and delayed the payment into long-term installments. Returning in triumph, Florence now had some breathing space, hoping that the emperor's invasion would unravel in the meantime and their cash might be spared. So, with that expectation, they yet again turned their attention to Pisa. But this time, instead of hiring mercenaries, the Signoria commissioned Machiavelli to use his newly recruited defence force to attack. By 1508, they were ready, and within a few months, the demoralised Pisans capitulated. The city had been under constant siege for almost a decade, but now, with a professional Florentine army of his making, they had seized Pisa in a matter of months. It was a stunning endorsement of his long-standing defence policy and proved to be the high watermark of his political career. To top it off, by the end of 1508, as hoped, Emperor Maximilian's indecisive invasion campaign had also fizzled, and the few tentative forays he made into Italy saw him utterly thrashed by the Venetians and their allies. With the empire in retreat, the Pope decided it was yet again his time to shine. His relationship with the French had long soured, and he now began pressuring all the smaller Italian states to submit to him or face his holy wrath. Florence, as usual, delayed committing to either side, but the French, finally having had enough of papal bombast, invaded in 1511. But the Pope was himself quick to pivot, cobbling together a fresh alliance with the Venetians, against whom he had only just recently fought a war, and drawing further support from the Holy Roman Emperor, the Spanish, and even Henry VIII of England. It was an unlikely coalition, to be sure, and the French made early progress, but their advance was eventually checked. Then, as with the previous invasion, they were forced into a fighting retreat all the way back to France. The vacillating Florentines now came under direct papal sanction. In his rage, Julius demanded a slew of resignations from the Signoria, again calling for the immediate reinstallation of the Medici to head its government. I guess it's good to be a banker after all. Being himself intimately involved in government policy, in 1512, Machiavelli now also was sacked by the incoming Medici, despite having loyally served the state for years and having no particular quarrel with either the Pope or the returning bankers. Indeed, it was they who had given him his big break as a young man. But in the tumultuous scramble that followed Medici restoration, he was arrested on false allegations of plotting a coup, imprisoned and tortured for several months, even enduring the strappado 6 times. He took his punishment with stoic fortitude, though by his own accounts he was in complete despair at the injustice. He might have been executed like many others, but just as things were getting grim, Pope Julius suddenly died, and Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, brother of Giuliano, now ruling over Florence, ascended the throne of St. Peter, taking the name Leo X. In celebration of this momentous Medici achievement, all the prisoners were set free, including Machiavelli, though he was banished to his father's farm in the countryside.
There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success, than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things.
Under any other circumstances, Machiavelli's time in the country might have been a welcome respite from the chaos engulfing the city, and his early letters suggest he had had enough of politics and intrigue. But for a man used to rubbing shoulders with kings and courtiers, the boredom of farm life quickly lost its charm. He soon slid into drinking and carousing once again, even very publicly falling in love with a local farm girl half his age, writing poetry and buying her gifts he could ill afford. Mrs. M, heavily pregnant once again, was beside herself, but not even his friends could prevail on Machiavelli to come to his senses, until some months after his new daughter was born, when she tragically passed away from illness, and the grief finally shocked him out of it. Machiavelli was one of those people who rarely ever heeded their own advice, and, ironically, was as blindly passionate in his own self-destructive behaviour as he was clinical in assessing that of others. But despite this domestic and emotional turmoil, one positive was that he at least found long stretches of time to reread his father's old books, as well as to reflect and journal on the course of his own career, and contemplate the wheel of fortune that saw his career, like that of so many others, rise and fall inexplicably. In 1513, an opportunity arose to provide some political advice to the new pope. He now threw himself into distilling all his experiences over 20 years of diplomacy into the book he is now most famous for, The Prince, hoping the volume would find favour with the Medici rulers and see him restored to office once more. The Prince is a book of just 30,000 words, spread over 26 short chapters, in which he gives cold, hard advice to a ruler on how best to succeed in managing the affairs of a kingdom. It's not the first advice book ever written. The ancient Chinese philosopher Mencius and the Greek philosopher Plato both gave plenty advice on good government as well. But their volumes were based on the construction of a utopian society by the harmonious cooperation of a model prince and a morally engaged populace. Suffice it to say, such societies have forever remained in the purely imaginary realm, with no successful example ever having survived for long, if at all. Machiavelli, on the other hand, was possibly the first to show political life as it really was, in all its ugliness, greed, and corruption, and based his advice on capitalizing on the way people actually behaved, not how he wished the world would be.
One can make this generalization about men. They are ungrateful, fickle, liars and deceivers. They shun danger and are greedy for profit. While you treat them well, they are yours. They would shed their blood for you, risk their property, their lives, their children, so long as danger is remote. But when you are in danger, they turn against you. It being my intention to write something useful for anyone who understands it, it seemed more suitable for me to search after the real truth of the matter rather than the imagination of it. Many writers have pictured republics and principalities that have never been seen, nor known to exist in reality. For there is such a distance between how one lives and how one ought to live, that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done achieves his downfall rather than his preservation. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil.
It's his completely unsentimental realism in analysing human behaviour and exploiting it as an opportunity for success that makes him such a pioneer in political philosophy. And it wasn't an exercise in personal musing. He wanted to offer a book of generalizations, formulas, and overarching rules which could be employed in the real world, ultimately to help secure Italy from foreign invasion. In The Prince, he presents 6 major arguments. 1. Though he didn't use these words directly, his central theme was that the ends justify the means. A prince should employ all methods necessary to ensure the common good for his people and state. Deceit, betrayal, sacrifice, extortion, and terror are all legitimate tools to secure power and ensure stability. 2. A prince must not allow religious sentiment to hamper his decisions or affect his actions. Religious awe is a powerful asset, but one must not be victim to it oneself. 3. All of us are subject to the vicissitudes of fortune, so we should prepare well for bad times by having contingencies in place. 4. A prince must be both strong and cunning. In his words, to be a lion as well as a fox. Some situations call for subversion and subtlety, while others require a ruthless projection of power. 5. A prince can only succeed long-term if he builds a permanent military to support his goals and secure his position. 6. And finally, a call to action, that the states of Italy should be united in order to survive into the future. In his volume, he drew heavily on the life of the ancients, illustrating each point over and over, using rich sources from Roman, Greek, and even Persian history. What's more, he also shared his own intimate experiences in the royal courts of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and from all across Italy, to ram the point home in a way that was confronting, real, and at times shocking. His go-to textbook example was Cesare Borgia, a man almost universally reviled since his downfall, but who seemed to naturally possess all the attributes Machiavelli was highlighting, but who had nevertheless managed to achieve unity, stability, and even peace and prosperity in the state he cobbled together during his lifetime. In Machiavelli's own words,
Cesare Borgia was considered cruel. Notwithstanding, his cruelty reconciled the Romagna, unified it, and restored it to peace and loyalty. And if this be rightly considered, he will be seen to have been much more merciful than the Florentine people, who, to avoid a reputation for cruelty, permitted Pistoia to be destroyed. Therefore, a prince, so long as he keeps his subjects united and loyal, ought not to mind the reproach of cruelty, because with a few examples he will be more merciful than those who, through too much mercy, allow disorders to arise, from which follow murders or robberies. For these are wont to injure the whole people, whilst those executions which originate with a prince offend the individual only.
He would go on to offer his most shocking piece of advice.
It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both.
And that it is more important to be effective than it is to be good. Unsurprisingly, the manuscript drew condemnation from all quarters, in a society that still either clung onto the delusions of religious utopianism or who refused to admit their own glaring hypocrisy. The Catholic Church even placed it on the Index of Prohibited Books in 1559. But critics and moral objectionists over the centuries often overlook his warnings to princes to beware of abusing their power.
A prince should not deviate from what is good, if possible, but he should know how to enter into evil when necessity demands. Yet it cannot be called prowess to kill fellow citizens, to betray friends, to be treacherous, pitiless, irreligious. These ways can win a prince power, but never glory.
The rejection of his masterpiece by the elites devastated him. He had come to see the Medici as Italy's greatest hope in unifying the country, to resist all the foreign invaders who had continually ravaged their lands, and believed that implementing his strategies would literally save their homeland. But it was not to be. The Medici went on ignoring him, and by 1517 it seemed as though fortune too had given up on him. But his years of reflection and writing in exile resulted in a completely new direction, publishing a long satirical poem called The Golden Ass, a playful but biting commentary on Florence's society, full of earthy humour and cynicism. For Machiavelli, it served as a form of self-therapy, humorously portraying himself as a donkey, travelling the countryside and interacting with a menagerie of politicians and critics, themselves depicted as various animals. In it we get to see a fresh side of him, a satirist and a joker, using humour to probe human folly. Then he wrote a novella called The Devil Who Took a Wife, a satire on marriage, domestic life, and the corruptions of Florentine society. The humour was bawdy, ironic, and deliberately outrageous. In the story, a demon is sent to Earth to discover whether marriage or hell is the worst torment. The enthusiastic demon takes the guise of a local nobleman and marries a Florentine woman. Soon, though, he finds earthly marriage more dreadful than the punishments of hell. Debts, nagging, social obligations, and financial ruin. The demon eventually flees his wife in terror, pursued even by creditors, and returns gladly to hell. Suffice it to say, Mrs. M was not amused, but the tale became popular all across Europe. It was even retold in later centuries by writers like La Fontaine. It was playful, naughty storytelling, and the public loved it. It was around this time that Machiavelli became associated with the Orti Orticellari, an intellectual circle of patricians, humanists, and younger intellectuals who gathered to discuss history, philosophy, and literature. The group was Republican-leaning, critical of Medici rule, and sympathetic to the values of civic liberty. For Machiavelli, banished from public office and snubbed by the Medici, it was a vital outlet, a place to share ideas, test arguments, and regain a kind of informal public voice in a quietly subversive environment. His deep knowledge of history, politics, and ancient literature saw him become something of a mentor to the wealthy young nobleman who would someday come to govern Florence, while his sense of humour and gift as a raconteur made him an unexpected celebrity once again. It was for these aspiring patricians that he wrote what would be called the Discourses of Livy, expansive personal reflections on Livy's history of Rome, using the Roman Republic as a lens to think about liberty, corruption, and the life cycle of states. He again drew on numerous examples from history, combined with contemporary political experience to flesh out the methodology of good government. Where the prince was aimed at rulers and what it took to acquire and hold a state, the Discourses was written for citizens, highlighting their role in the running and maintenance of a successful society, which, by the way, he concluded was, in its ideal form, a republic. The book offered a stinging rebuke to the idiots who were now running Florence as petty despots, and it expressed a significant change from the coldly utilitarian tone of the prince, emphasizing the civic value of pursuing beauty. He would later write,
Infamous and detestable are those men who are enemies of the virtues, of letters, and of every art that brings utility and honor to the human race, as are the impious, the violent, the ignorant, the worthless, the idle, and the cowardly.
The Discourses, finished in 1518, often seen as a companion to the prince, seems in many respects to be a contrast. Was it a change of heart when he finally came to reconcile himself with the end of his political career? An abrupt shift in message to ingratiate himself with the new literati of Florence? Or was it a re-emergence of his deeper-held republican sympathies? Several historians have suggested that, despite the facade, the prince was written with a deep sense of irony, and that his well-known republicanism is evident in all his other works. But given that he dedicated the prince to the Medici and the Discourses to his new chums of the intelligentsia, it wouldn't be a stretch to conclude that he was being, if you'll forgive me, somewhat Machiavellian in simply aligning himself with what he thought was the best career option at the time. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. In any case, Machiavelli certainly wasn't shy in his ongoing mockery of the powers that be. Notably in his next project, La Mandragola, or The Mandrake Root, was a sharp satirical comedy about corruption, lust, and deceit, first staged around 1518. It became a smash hit not just in Florence, but all around Europe, and is still performed to this day, and often cited as the greatest Italian Renaissance comedy ever written. In the story, Callimaco, a handsome young libertine, returning from study abroad, lusts after Lucrezia, a virtuous married woman. To seduce her, he conspires with a parasite called Ligurio and a corrupt priest to trick Lucrezia's foolish husband, Nietzsche. The ruse involves giving Lucrezia a potion made from mandrake root that supposedly cures infertility but kills the first man who sleeps with her after he drinks it. The idiot husband agrees to let a stranger, Callimaco in disguise, be the sucker and take the supposed fatal risk. And thus Callimaco gets what he wants. There is plenty of smutty innuendo and not so subtle allusion to contemporary political figures, attacking both the clergy and wealthy idiot snobs of Florence. This play actually brought Machiavelli more international fame than his diplomatic career ever did, and it was even performed in front of the Pope, who failed to notice the not-so-subtle clerical critiques. But satire was not his only interest at the time. In 1520, he finished his most systematic political treatise after The Prince and the Discourses, The Art of War, and it's the only one printed during his lifetime. The Art of War has often been compared with Sun Tzu's The Art of War, written in the 5th century BC in China, though they differ sharply in spirit. Machiavelli's Art of War is about building a republic's freedom on the discipline of citizen soldiers. Sun Tzu's Art of War is about winning by guile, speed, and adaptability. The Art of War had been dedicated to Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, who was soon to become Pope Clement VII, and he now also commissioned Machiavelli to write a comprehensive history of Florence, with a not-so-subtle agenda to sing the praises of the Medici bloodline. For Machiavelli, this was finally a readmission into the family's good graces, and for which he received a decent stipend. Moreover, he was also occasionally dispatched on minor diplomatic missions, though he would never again return to the halls of power, or negotiate with kings as he did before. In his 8-volume opus of the history, Machiavelli covered themes such as the ceaseless factionalism of Florentine politics, for example, the War of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and even the ancient Roman optimates versus the populares. He explored the corrosive effects of internal strife and weak institutions, and the role of fortune and leadership in shaping civic destiny.
There is nothing more difficult than to persuade free men of something that contradicts their interests.
It seemed like this was as good as it was going to get for Machiavelli, but on the upside, his play was packing theatres from Venice to Paris. One of his many new admirers was Barbara Salutati, an actress, the wife of a local notary and a reputed beauty. Now, when most people look at Machiavelli's famous portrait, it's hardly the first thing that comes to mind, but despite being well past his prime and now in his 50s, Il Macchia, or the man, as his friends called him, still had considerable pulling power when it came to the ladies. He was very much, as the saying goes, a lover, not a fighter, and Barbara became just the latest in a long list of groupies. But in this case, he would fall head over heels again, and the two conducted a scandalous and very public love affair that would go on till the day he died. As previously, his friends reproached him over and over, but he was adamant and once again let loose with the poetry.
The Lady Barbara, who sets my heart alight, whose laughter binds me tighter than any chain, makes me forget all sorrows when she is in sight.
Poor old long-suffering Mrs. Mac, now with 6 kids in tow, seems to have resigned herself to her husband's raging infidelities. And even his oldest son Bernardo, now a young man himself, turned a blind eye. Indeed, father and sons enjoyed the kind of bond that Machiavelli had with his own father, and when he was away they exchanged many letters, often with warmth and candour. Despite his appalling failure as a husband, he seems to have been a genuinely doting and anxious father. An episode of how his comedic writing influenced his ongoing career occurred in 1521, when the Medici sent him on a small diplomatic mission to negotiate a dispute they had with the friars of a Franciscan monastery in the town of Carpi. The condescending abbot thought little of his scandalous has-been interlocutor and proved a tough man to budge. To up the ante, Machiavelli orchestrated an elaborate ruse, in which one of his friends would dispatch a courier in full government livery to gallop into the abbey and deliver him urgent sealed messages several times a day, while the friars looked on perplexed. The charade continued over successive days, and the friars now became increasingly intimidated. Claiming to be receiving dispatches about the disputes between France and the Holy Roman Empire, Machiavelli, feigning impatience, ramped up the pressure, threatening to bring ruin to the monastery for wasting his precious time. The bluff soon paid off, and the panicked friars caved in to his demands. Skullduggery at its finest. The subsequent humorous correspondence between Machiavelli and his accomplice mate, mocking the credulity of the friars, is yet another insight into his cheeky sense of humour, that goes very much against his reputation as a deadly serious cynic. But if you think this episode was Machiavelli at his mischievous best, he had yet another ace to play. The acclaim and satisfaction he received for his subversive play La Mandragola eventually spurred him on to write an even more smutty comedy performed in 1525, Clizia, in which a wealthy old man by the name of Niccomaco, a play on his own name, and his son Cleandro both lust after a beautiful young ward in their household by the name of Clizia, pun probably intended. Each of them plots to marry her off to a servant who will secretly hand her over. In the end, their schemes completely unravel, exposing their foolishness, and Clizia marries the worthy young man she truly loves. The play was yet another self-deprecating satire of his own life, especially his long-running love affair with Barbara Salutati, who he even convinced to play the part of the heroine, while Machiavelli himself came on stage to play the old lecher, who tries and comically fails to bed the beautiful woman. The failure was an allusion to the impossibility of his own relationship with Barbara ever being anything more than just an affair. Here, Machiavelli turned private folly into public laughter, mocking the vanity of men his own age while slyly confessing how desire can make fools of us all. Like his other comedy, La Mandragola, Clizia was a huge success. Its plot was simple, raunchy, and appealed to audiences of all classes, turning personal scandal into comedy gold. Something that later writers, such as Voltaire, would study in great detail. But as 1525 dragged on, there was trouble on the horizon once more. Charles V, King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, was overwhelmingly strong. He controlled Spain, Naples, Austria, the Low Countries, and much of the New World. Italy was becoming a Habsburg lake, and this frightened Clement VII, who feared papal independence would evaporate if Charles dominated the peninsula. In the north, thanks largely to Clement's efforts, Milan was back under nominal Sforza rule, but was effectively a puppet state under Charles V, and Clement was now worried that it would be used as a staging ground for an offensive into the rest of Italy. Meanwhile, new French king Francis I was also hoping to reassert French sovereignty over Milan, at the time the economic jewel in the crown of Italy. In 1524 he made his move, besieging the city of Pavia, but Charles's forces intercepted him and, with a much smaller army, completely routed the French, even capturing Francis himself. It goes without saying that the campaign came to a humiliating end, and Francis was promptly removed to Madrid, languishing there throughout the rest of the year. King Francis was pressured into signing the Treaty of Madrid in 1526 and was released, on condition he give up all pretensions to Italy, marry Charles's sister, cede Burgundy to the empire, and leave his own sons as hostages of the Spanish. In a textbook Machiavellian move, he signed the treaty and then promptly reneged on it when he returned to France. By now, the Pope was well and truly panicked about the empire's ambitions and threw his full weight behind the French king, absolving him of any dishonour and formalising an alliance, also dragging in Venice, Milan, and Florence in what would become known as the League of Cognac. Now, this combined force should have been more than capable of repelling an imperial invasion, but each of the allies continually pulled in their own direction. France was desperate for revenge, and the Pope, despite having excellent advisers, now including Machiavelli, consistently either failed to act, or when he did, acted against their recommendations. For Machiavelli, this was déjà vu. Where he had previously spent years bailing out an indecisive Florentine government, now he had a dithering pope on his hands, who just couldn't seem to do anything right. Nevertheless, the Pope at least reinstated Machiavelli to a full ministerial portfolio, overseeing Florence's defences, and with the help of his son Bernardo, they worked night and day to fortify the city walls, as well as drill new regiments of soldiers. The time for comedy was over. Machiavelli now threw himself back into his old role of saving Florence from ruin, with what his contemporaries described as the energy of 3 men. But as 1527 dragged on, cities fell and then changed hands multiple times, and the discoordination and squabbling among the coalition resulted in successive losses. Machiavelli's fortifications had done their job as a deterrent, but Charles simply bypassed them and pushed on south toward Rome, laying siege. By now, the Pope had become so ineffectual that a number of his closest cardinals began plotting his downfall, and as the imperial troops gathered, the conspirators opened the gates and let them in. Now, these troops were largely comprised of Protestant anti-papal Germans, who despised Catholics as evil. What's more, they hadn't been paid in months. Any restraint on them evaporated with the death of their commander, such that they now sacked Rome with a ferocity and barbarity not seen since the days of the Goths and Vandals. By all accounts, it was far worse. The Pope's mercenary Swiss bodyguards put up a heroic defence, suffering such enormous casualties while helping him escape that they henceforth earned the privilege of remaining the Pope's personal bodyguard to this very day. Machiavelli was also in Rome witnessing the carnage, and now took on the task of negotiating with Charles's representatives on terms for the release of the Pope, and we get a glimpse of his despair from his many letters, writing with a tenderness and affection that seems quite at odds with his universal image as a cold and calculating diplomat. He was anxious for the safety of his family, and amongst the usual fatherly advice, to study and work hard, he charged his sons to take good care of their mother.
Greet Madonna Marietta for me, and tell her I have never longed so much to return to Florence as I do now. But there is nothing I can do.
Thanks in large part to Machiavelli's efforts, a peace treaty and release of the Pope was eventually negotiated, and while the pontiff returned to the smouldering ruins of his city, Machiavelli too made his own way home, horrified at the destruction, famine, and now a fresh outbreak of the plague that devastated the entire Tuscan countryside. It made him even more vocal about the need for unity and a professional defence force to protect citizens from invasion. Florence, meanwhile, now free of both papal and foreign control, yet again overthrew and expelled their Medici rulers and reinstated the Florentine Republic. Unfortunately for Machiavelli, his tenure in the Signoria, so recently renewed, was abruptly terminated, and he once again found himself unemployed. Despite his incarceration, torture, and humiliation at the hands of the Medici, many viewed his restoration by them suspiciously, while others believed his political and scandalous satirical works would further tarnish the city's already sullied reputation. Even his literary circle, fearful for their own futures, now kept him at arm's length. Completely heartbroken, he died just a couple of months after the restoration of the Republic. Some say from deliberate medical mismanagement of an illness. He was buried in Santa Croce, Florence, later to be honoured with a tomb inscribed Tanto nomini nullum par elogium. No eulogy is equal to so great a name. So, what can we say about Niccolò Machiavelli, a man dismissed as a cynic, when, in truth, he worked tirelessly for the liberty of his homeland? Branded by many as the tutor of tyrants, yet much of his life was spent in the service of a fragile republic. A court secretary of modest birth, who conversed with kings and popes, yet died excluded by both Republicans and Medici alike. He was a Casanova, playful and bawdy, but piercingly serious in his reflections on power. Misperceived for centuries as the prophet of deceit, his writings were also a warning to citizens about the trickery of rulers. In his professional life, he showed great insight into the human mind, but in his personal affairs, he was often reckless, neglectful, and driven by his base passions. Machiavelli was all of these at once, a formidable patriot, but also a deadbeat husband, a realist and a hopeless romantic, a punchy satirist and a peerless negotiator who was one of the first writers to strip politics down to its hard, human truths for all to see, regardless of consequences. That may be why, 500 years on, his name still provokes debate, and why his words remain as sharp and unsettling as the day they were first written. If you enjoy our content, please show us some love by liking and sharing with your friends, dropping a comment or two, and by subscribing to the channel. It really does help us grow and reach more people. Check out our socials and website too for additional material, interesting historical nuggets, and news. If you've got some cash to spare and are feeling generous, why not become a Patreon supporter and immortalize your name in the credits of future videos? Or not. Even anonymous cash is welcome. See the description section for options. Trust me, I'm a long way from driving a Bugatti and quitting my day job. But whatever your position is, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.